Hello, my name is Catherine. I am 65 years old, and for 32 years, I truly believed I had built a perfect marriage. But everything changed on a night that was supposed to be a celebration. At his own birthday dinner, my husband looked me in the eyes with a coldness I had never seen before and declared, almost casually, "We're going to have an open marriage." For a moment, time froze around me. But something inside me, something quiet, tired, and finally awake, answered with an icy calm that even frightened me. "Then it's over." I slipped on my coat, called my dog to my side, and walked out into the night without looking back. 20 minutes later, as I sat in my car trying to understand what had just happened, my phone buzzed. It was a message from his secretary, someone I barely knew. Attached was a screenshot that shattered every memory, every promise, every piece of the life I thought we had built together. And that was only the beginning of the truth I was about to uncover. If you want to know what I discovered next, stay with me, because nothing about this story is what you expect. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages. Now, let's go back and understand how this story really began. I never imagined a life could split cleanly in half within a single breath. But that's what happened the night everything shattered. It was Richard's birthday, 32 years of marriage behind us. A lifetime of routines and quiet rituals I thought meant something. I had spent the afternoon preparing his favorite dinner, roast chicken with rosemary, lemon potatoes, the chocolate tart he always pretended not to crave but devoured the moment it cooled. Pepper, my little poodle, followed me around the kitchen with that soft tapping of his paws on the tile, sensing my excitement, or maybe borrowing it. When Richard arrived, he didn't kiss my cheek the way he used to. He simply hung his coat on the chair, loosened his tie, and sat down as if he were a guest, and not the man I had shared a bed and life with for decades. Still, I tried to pretend nothing was wrong. I poured wine, asked about his day, attempted to keep my voice bright. Pepper nestled beside my foot under the table, warm and loyal, unaware that my world was about to collapse. Halfway through dinner, Richard set his fork down with a soft clink, the kind of sound you forget instantly on most nights. But this one lodged itself permanently in my memory. I looked up, half smiling, waiting for him to thank me or make some small comment. Instead, he looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, cold, distant, rehearsed. "Catherine," he said, clearing his throat once, "I've been giving this a lot of thought. I want us to have an open marriage." For a moment, I didn't understand the words. They floated between us like smoke, impossible to grasp. My hands froze around the stem of my glass. The room felt suddenly airless. Pepper shifted, sensing the tension, pressing closer to my ankle. "Anne, open marriage?" I repeated, my voice thin. He nodded, almost impatiently. "It's healthier for people our age. We've grown apart. This could work, if you'd just be reasonable about it." Reasonable. As if I were the one proposing to dismantle 3 decades of trust. Something inside me didn't break, it hardened. I felt a strange, icy calm rise from somewhere deep, a place I didn't even know existed. I pushed my chair back slowly. The legs scraped the floor, harsh and final, like a door closing. "No," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "Then it's over." Richard blinked, startled, as if he had expected tears or begging. But I had nothing left to give him. I stood, took my coat from the hook, and called Pepper softly. He trotted to me instantly, tail low, eyes wide. As I opened the door, the cold Portland night air hit my face, damp, heavy with the smell of rain. I stepped outside without looking back, my fingers buried in Pepper's soft fur as we walked into the darkness. For a few minutes I felt numb. Nothing more than a woman walking through wet streets with her dog, trying to hold her bones together. Then my phone buzzed. The name on the screen made my stomach clench. Sarah, Richard's secretary. I hadn't spoken to her, More than a handful of times. She always seemed polite, shy even. I opened her message, expecting a question about Richard's calendar. What I saw instead buckled my knees. A screenshot text messages between her and Richard. 3 years worth. I scrolled, each line slicing deeper. She suspects nothing. The old fool made me her favorite meal again. Once I'm out, I'm taking the house. I stopped walking, my breath fogged the air. Pepper nudged my leg, sensing my shaking. My vision blurred as another bubble appeared, Sarah's message. I'm sorry. I didn't know he was lying to me too. He promised we'd be together. Tonight he told me you were okay with an open marriage so he could transition out. Catherine, he's been planning to take everything, even the house your parents left you. My parents' house. The thought of it felt like a physical blow every Christmas morning, every birthday, every memory soaked into the walls of that home. A gift they'd trusted me to protect. Pepper whined softly, licking the tips of my trembling fingers. His little body pressed against my leg like he was trying to anchor me to the world. I sank onto a bench under a flickering streetlight, the rain softening into mist around us. I scrolled through more messages, each one revealing just how thoroughly Richard had rewritten our life behind my back, behind everyone's back. The betrayal was so vast I couldn't even cry. It was too big for tears, too sharp, too overwhelming. I felt as though someone had reached inside my chest and pulled out every warm memory, leaving only the echo of what had once been my life. I don't know how long I sat there, Pepper curled against me, my phone heavy in my hand, my breath shaky. The world looked different, colder, tilted, as if the ground under me had shifted inches to the left. Finally, I whispered into Pepper's fur, "It's just you and me now." He looked up at me with those dark, trusting eyes, and something inside me cracked, not from pain, but from the smallest flicker of resolve. I stood. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing with absolute clarity. I would not let Richard destroy me. Not after everything I had given. Not after everything he had taken. Not while I still had breath in my body and my dog at my side. I spent that first night at Dorothy's house, though the word spent feels too simple for what actually happened. I arrived on her doorstep trembling, soaked in cold rain and heartbreak. Pepper pressed against my leg as if he were trying to hold me upright. Dorothy opened the door before I even had the chance to knock twice. She took one look at my face, placed a soft, steadying hand on my shoulder, and gently ushered me inside. Dorothy was 70, a retired lawyer with silver hair pulled into a bun that always looked on the verge of unraveling. Her house smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a warm, familiar scent that wrapped itself around me the moment I stepped in. I felt my throat tighten, the kind of ache that warns a sob is coming, but nothing came. I was past crying. Or maybe I was simply hollow. She led me to the kitchen, sat me down, and began preparing tea with the same deliberate calmness she used whenever she told me stories about the courtroom. Pepper settled under the table, curling his body around my feet like a protective ring. His little sighs of concern floated up every few minutes, as if he were apologizing for not understanding everything, but determined to comfort me anyway. "Catherine, honey," Dorothy said gently as she placed a steaming cup in front of me. "You've got a fighter in you that you haven't met yet." Her voice was low, steady, warm, so different from Richard's clipped tone, the one he used when he wanted to make me feel small without saying it outright. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into fingers that were still shaking. I wanted to answer her, but my voice was gone. It was as if grief had reached into my throat and pressed its palm against it. All I could do was stare at the swirling steam rising from the mug. Dorothy didn't push. She never pushed. Instead, she sat across from me with the patience of someone who'd spent a lifetime watching people fall apart and put themselves back together. When I finally managed to speak, my voice cracked. "He planned it," I whispered. "All of it." Dorothy nodded slowly, her eyes softening. "Yes, and we're going to unravel every piece of his plan. She opened a folder on the table, one that hadn't existed 10 minutes earlier. I didn't even want to ask how she had assembled so much in so little time. Dorothy was built from a different era, where a woman didn't ask for permission to be formidable. She explained everything with quiet precision. How Richard had been strategically moving money over the last few months. How he had funneled funds into private accounts. How he had positioned himself as the responsible spouse while painting a future narrative where I was the one who had abandoned him. Abandoned him when he was the one who had shattered our life with a sentence over dinner. And that, Dorothy said, tapping the folder, is why Sarah reached out. I lifted my eyes to her, confusion knitting across my forehead. I still don't understand why she helped me. She didn't owe me anything. Dorothy gave a humorless laugh. Oh, Catherine. That girl finally realized she wasn't Richard's only affair. I blinked, stunned. I already knew about her messages, her involvement. But hearing that he'd had others, multiple others, made something inside me tilt. It wasn't jealousy. It was the realization that the man I had loved had not been real. He had been a carefully crafted illusion, a performance sustained by my hope and my trust. Dorothy continued, her voice steady. He promised her marriage, a future. She thought she was the woman he truly wanted. But it turns out he was seeing 2 other women as well. Sarah found out only recently. That's when she understood everything he'd told her was a lie. I felt my stomach twist. I pictured Sarah, 28, young, hopeful, believing in a story that was never hers to begin with. She must have felt foolish, used, betrayed. My heart hurt for her despite everything. Betrayal isn't selective. It wounds everyone it touches. That's why she reached out, Dorothy said, her tone firm but compassionate. She sent us everything, bank statements, property documents, internal files, everything we'll need. My fingers hovered above the folder but didn't touch it. My hands felt too fragile, as if contact with the truth might break them. I stared at the papers like they were written in another language. Dorothy watched me quietly. You don't have to look at it now. I don't know who he is, I murmured. The man I lived with, I don't recognize him. I know, she said softly. Realizing that someone you loved was a stranger. It's one of the deepest wounds there is. Pepper, sensing my despair, nudged my leg with his warm little nose. When I didn't move, he disappeared into the living room, only to return with his favorite toy-worn, faded tennis ball that he guarded like treasure. He dropped it gently on my lap and looked up at me with hopeful eyes. It was such a small gesture, so innocent. So full of unconditional love that my chest tightened until I had to press a hand against it. I lifted the ball and pressed my forehead to Pepper's. He wagged his tail slowly, almost solemnly. Some love really was still pure. I stayed at Dorothy's house that night, lying on her guest bed, while rain slid down the windows in thin, silver streaks. I didn't sleep. My body was exhausted, but my mind spun in slow, painful circles. Images of Richard's face, the messages, the years I had lost to someone who hadn't cherished them. I stared at the ceiling until the early morning light began to creep across the room. When I entered the kitchen, Dorothy was already up, wearing a robe with tiny embroidered daisies and holding a cup of coffee like it was an old friend. A second cup waited for me. There were papers spread across the table, neater now, organized, forming a structure I didn't yet understand. By morning, she said without turning, I've mapped out a plan. I sat down slowly, Pepper hopping into the chair beside me, like he had declared himself my emotional bodyguard. Dorothy finally looked at me, her eyes sharp with the kind of determination that made me feel, for the first time in hours, that maybe I wasn't drowning. There's something you need to know, she said. Richard works for the largest real estate firm in Oregon. He's got powerful friends, and he will fight dirty. Her warning hung in the air, heavy and unforgiving. I swallowed hard. So what do we do? Dorothy leaned forward, her voice steady as stone. We fight dirtier, but with truth on our side. For the first time since the night before, I felt something flicker inside me, a small, trembling spark. Hope. Not loud or brave, but alive. And that was enough to keep breathing. I hadn't realized how small I had become until I saw myself reflected in the cruiser's window. A woman folded inward, shoulders curled as though trying to shield a heart that had already been shattered. The ride back to the house felt unreal, like I was being transported toward a life that no longer belonged to me. The officer driving didn't speak, but every few seconds he glanced at me in the mirror as if checking whether I was still there or whether I might dissolve into the air like breath on glass. When we pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had, same rose bushes I once planted with hope. Same curtains I'd sewn myself, same porch where Pepper used to curl up in the sunlight. But the moment I stepped out of the car, a coldness washed over me, as if the house itself had expelled every trace of warmth I had once poured into it. I walked inside feeling like a guest, or worse, an intruder. My own footsteps echoed strangely, and the silence had the texture of abandonment. Pepper trotted in beside me, tail low, ears alert. Even she seemed to sense the shift, looking around with a tense alertness that made my chest tighten. Richard wasn't there. Of course he wasn't. He never stayed for the aftermath, only for the destruction. But on the kitchen table, his absence was replaced by neat stacks of papers waiting like a cruel welcome. His lawyer's letterhead gleamed at the top. I didn't even have to sit down to feel the blow. My eyes caught a few sentences and the breath left my lungs. He was already filing, already claiming I had been mentally unstable for years, already twisting every vulnerability I had ever confided to him into evidence. The officer stood a polite distance away, but I could feel his discomfort in the air. This was the part no one ever teaches you, how humiliating it is to read lies about your own mind in front of a stranger sworn to protect you. I swallowed hard, blinked back the burning in my eyes, and forced my trembling hands to keep moving. I gathered the papers, shoved them into a bag, and told myself to keep breathing. I went upstairs to start packing the clothes I could take. I avoided the photos on the hallway wall once, lovely memories that now felt like bruises. It was Pepper who anchored me. She moved from room to room as though inspecting them on my behalf, her soft paws patting over the wood floors, occasionally brushing against my leg like a reminder that at least one being in this house still chose me, still believed me. When I reached Richard's home office, the air seemed heavier. I'd always hated that room, the dimness, the smell of stale coffee, the piles of documents he guarded like secrets. Pepper stopped in the doorway, her body suddenly rigid. Then she let out a sharp bark that sliced through the quiet. "Pepper, sweetheart." "It's okay," I whispered. But she barked again, louder this time, and began scratching at the floor. Not at the furniture. Not at the rug. The floor. She kept digging frantically, her nails clicking and scraping, as if something beneath the wood was calling to her. "What is it?" I knelt, feeling ridiculous at first, until my hand slid over a board that shifted slightly under my touch. A loose floorboard. My heart lurched inside my chest. I wedged my fingers into the space and pulled. It lifted with a soft, sickening creak. Underneath, tucked neatly into a recessed space, sat a fireproof box I had never seen in my life. My name wasn't on it. Nothing was. That anonymity alone made my pulse quicken. I hesitated. Some part of me didn't want to know, because once you see the truth, you can't ever unsee it. But Pepper nudged my arm with her nose as if urging me forward. So I opened it. What I found was the kind of thing you imagine only in nightmares. Documents, neatly organized, labeled, stapled, describing transactions I had never authorized. There was a forged version of my signature, replicated so perfectly it made my stomach turn. Pages showing that Richard had taken out a second mortgage on my parents' house. My parents' house. A place that had been fully paid off long before they died. A place meant to be preserved for memories and maybe, one day, for my future grandchildren. $400,000. Gone. Transferred to offshore accounts I had never heard of. The room tilted slightly, as though the world had shifted off its axis. My hands shook so violently that I had to steady them against the desk. I felt Pepper press her warm body against my leg, grounding me, keeping me from floating away into panic. But it wasn't over. Not even close. There were envelopes filled with photographs. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. The angles were strange, blurry, dark. Then it hit me. These were photos of me, through windows, through the crack of a barely opened door, standing in the kitchen, sitting in the garden, sleeping. Each photo had a timestamp. Notes about my daily routine. Comments about my increasingly erratic behavior. Footprint. By footprint documentation of my life, collected not out of concern but calculation. It felt like being skinned alive, realizing someone you loved had been watching you not with affection but scrutiny, not with care but strategy. My throat closed. I nearly dropped the box. Pepper whimpered quietly, nudging her head into my hand as if to pull me back into my body, back into myself. I curled my fingers into her soft fur and breathed in her warmth. Without her, I think I might have collapsed. At the very bottom of the box was a single folded sheet of paper, handwritten. I knew the handwriting instantly. Sharp strokes, slanted letters, that overly confident flourish at the end of his signature. The note wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Once the house is sold and she's declared incompetent, the rest will be easy. For a long moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words sat in my mind like ice, spreading cold through my chest, numbing me. Declared incompetent. As if I were an inconvenient obstacle to be cleared. Not a person. Not his wife. Not the woman who had loved him for more than 3 decades. The officer stepped forward when he saw my shoulders slump, but I held up a hand. I didn't want witnesses to my collapse. I didn't want anyone to see me break. But I didn't break. Not fully. Not this time. A strange clarity slowly washed over me, thin, at first, like a whisper, then growing stronger. This was the truth. The ugliness, laid bare. And the truth, even when it hurts, even when it destroys what's left of your illusions, is still a kind of liberation. I closed the box gently, pulled Pepper into my arms, and let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for years. He thought declaring me incompetent would be easy. He thought erasing me would be easy. He thought I would crumble quietly. But Pepper's warmth in my arms told another story, one where I wasn't done, one where I would fight, one where I would rise. And for the first time since everything fell apart, I felt the faintest spark of something I had forgotten I was capable of. Resolve. Janet spread the documents across Dorothy's dining table with the precision of someone accustomed to turning chaos into clarity. She didn't look like what I imagined a powerful attorney to be, no rigid blazer, no cold expression. Instead, she wore a soft cardigan and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose. But when she focused on the papers, her entire posture sharpened, as if the truth itself called her to attention. She flipped through the forged signatures, the offshore transfers, the photos of me taken through windows, one by one. Her jaw tightened. The more she read, the more her voice changed, low at first, then trembling with controlled fury. She lifted the stack of documents as though the weight itself offended her. This is fraud, identity theft, financial abuse, conspiracy. Catherine, we can bury him with this. Dorothy reached out and placed her hand over mine, a gesture meant to soothe me, but my fingers were stiff and cold. It was strange, hearing someone speak of Richard with that kind of righteous anger. For decades, his voice had been the one filling our home. Mine had been the one shrinking to make space. But hearing Janet speak so plainly, so firmly, felt like inhaling clean air after living too long in smoke. Then, Janet exhaled slowly, placing the papers down again. There is a complication. My heartbeat stumbled. There was always a complication. Richard's business partner, she continued, is married to a family court judge. Dorothy's eyes widened. I felt my stomach drop. Janet nodded with a grimness that made my skin prickle. They've been socializing for years. Vacations, dinners, charity events. Which means if Richard moves firsthand, trust me, he'll make sure he lands in front of a judge who already thinks you're unstable. The word unstable felt like a bruise pressed too hard. So what do? I asked, my voice small but steady. We move fast, Janet said. Fast and smart. We build a case so airtight it won't matter who's sitting on the bench, and we expose the connections if we have to. Her determination steadied something inside me that had been shaking for days. The next week blurred into a mosaic of paperwork, phone calls, hushed conversations over coffee, and moments when I had to step into the bathroom just to breathe. Pepper followed me everywhere, lying at my feet during meetings, resting her head on my lap when exhaustion threatened to swallow me. I gathered bank statements that showed discrepancies I had once brushed off as accounting errors. I spoke with neighbors who had seen unfamiliar women coming in and out of the house while I was away. Dorothy helped me retrieve old voicemails from Richard's snapped commands, belittling remarks, subtle manipulations that now sounded like confessions. Janet coordinated everything. She sent investigators to speak with people who had once worked with Richard and quit abruptly. She requested access to security footage from our neighbor's porch camera. The video showed images I could barely bring myself to watch women entering my home like guests while I had been in the grocery store, at the doctor, visiting my therapist, affairs, plural, layers of betrayal, years of it. There were nights I sat on Dorothy's sofa with my head in my hands. Pepper's warm body curled against me and wondered how I hadn't seen any of it. But grief has a strange way of making us question our own reality, as if we should have been clairvoyant instead of trusting. Sarah, my former caregiver, the one Richard had pressured to testify against, contacted Janet with a quiet apology trembling in her voice. She handed over recordings she had made when Richard began pushing her too far. In one of them, Richard's voice was unmistakable. She needs to look erratic, paranoid, confused. You're the one who sees her daily, so make it believable. Hearing it was like being stabbed with something cold. My hands went numb. He used me, Sarah whispered, and he planned to destroy you. I'm so sorry. Janet reassured her gently, but I saw the guilt etched into the woman's face like permanent lines. Even through my pain, I felt a small stirring of compassion for her. We were all victims of his manipulation in different ways. 2 days later, my brother Tom flew in from Boston. When he saw me standing at Dorothy's door with swollen eyes, thinner cheeks, and a tight, brittle smile, he pulled me into his arms like he used to when we were children. Katie, he murmured into my hair, shaking his head. I never trusted him, but I never imagined this. Never. It felt like something inside me cracked open, not in a painful way, but in a relieving one, like a tightly wound knot finally loosening. We spent the afternoon walking through Washington Park, trying to let our minds rest. The sky was soft gray, the air cool enough to sting lightly against our cheeks. Pepper trotted alongside us, leash gently swinging. We were halfway down a quiet path when Pepper stopped suddenly. Her ears perked up, body leaning forward with purpose. Pepper, what is it, girl? I asked, but she pulled firmly toward a bench beneath a towering maple tree. A woman sat there, hunched forward, face buried in her hands. Her shoulders shook with soundless sobs. Even from a distance, grief radiated from her like heat. Pepper approached her first, resting her front paws on the bench as if offering comfort. Woman looked up, startled. Her eyes were swollen and red. She brushed at her cheeks, embarrassed. I'm sorry, she said, voice cracking. I didn't mean to upset your dog. She's comforting you, I said gently. She only does that when someone's hurting. The woman let out a shaky laugh that dissolved quickly into another sob. That obvious, huh? Tom stood back, giving us space. I sat beside her, Pepper settling between us like a small guardian. My name is Catherine, I offered, and this is Pepper. The woman swallowed hard before whispering, I'm Ashley. There was something hesitant in the way she said it, a fragility I recognized all too well. After a long, trembling breath, she whispered, I just found out something horrible about someone I was involved with. A cold awareness prickled up my spine. His name. She wiped her eyes again as if afraid to speak it aloud. His name is Richard. For a moment, the world tilted. I felt Tom step closer behind me, sensing the shift. Ashley saw my expression and went still. You know him? Yes. My voice barely made it past my lips. I was married to him. Her face crumpled. Not with guilt, though there was some of that, but with devastation. Oh my God, I didn't know. He told me you were wealthy, that you didn't love him, that once he got the house and the inheritance, we'd start our life together. My throat burned. Inheritance? She nodded miserably. Your parents' money. He talked about it constantly. But then her breath shuddered, and I found out he said the same thing to at least 3 other women. He promised each of us a future he was funding with your life. The realization washed over me slowly, painfully, a cold wave across raw skin. For a moment, I felt the old instinct to shrink, to internalize the shame. But Pepper nudged me, warm and grounding, and I realized something with startling clarity. I was not the broken one here. Richard was. And his world, built on lies and manipulation, was finally collapsing from every direction. Ashley sobbed again, covering her face. I put a hand on her back, feeling her tremble beneath my palm. You're not alone, I whispered, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. None of us are. And we're going to make sure he never does this to anyone again. In that moment, under the gray sky and rustling leaves of Washington Park, something shifted inside me. Not vindication, not triumph, something quieter, deeper. Reclamation. Piece by piece, I was beginning to reclaim myself. And with every truth uncovered, every ally gathered, I felt myself stepping back into the world, not as the broken woman Richard tried to erase, but as someone rising from the wreckage with clearer eyes and a stronger heart. Pepper rested her head on my knee, and for the first time, I believed I might survive this. Janet filed the countersuit the very next morning. She worked with a focus so exact it felt almost surgical. Papers printed, affidavits organized, timestamps highlighted, recordings transcribed. Every piece of evidence we had gathered, every betrayal, every forged document, every lie was woven together like strands in a net designed to trap a man who'd spent years slipping through cracks. But Janet didn't soften her voice when she spoke to me. She didn't dress her warnings in comfort, or pretend this would be clean or easy. She sat across from me at Dorothy's dining table, elbows resting on folders, her expression steady but grave. He's going to retaliate, Catherine, she said softly, almost regretfully. And it won't be pretty. I nodded, not because I felt brave, but because fear had become such a constant companion that there was no room left for new reactions. Pepper was curled beneath my chair, his warm ribs rising and falling against my foot. I reached down, stroking him gently, grounding myself in the simple rhythm of his breath. 2 days passed. They were quiet, not peaceful, but the kind of quiet that feels like the air right before a storm breaks. Dorothy tried to distract me with baking, old movies, long walks with Pepper. I tried to pretend it helped. But on the morning of the second day, the storm arrived. It came in the shape of 3 police officers knocking on Dorothy's door just after sunrise, their vests reflecting light, their faces solemn. Dorothy stood frozen in her nightgown, clutching the edge of the doorframe as if steadying the entire house with her hands. "Catherine Patterson?" the lead officer asked gently. "Yes," I said, my voice thinning in my throat. "We have a warrant for your arrest." There was something unreal about those words, as if spoken in the wrong house, meant for someone else. Dorothy gasped softly. Pepper barked once sharp, startled, then again and again, louder each time, as if trying to alert the world something was terribly wrong. "Arrest?" I repeated, the word foreign in my mouth. "For what?" "Your husband, Richard Patterson, filed a report stating you stole $50,000 from your joint account." The world seemed to tilt. I steadied myself on the back of a chair. "That's impossible," I whispered. "I withdrew $3,000. $3. For food and clothes. That's all." Dorothy stepped forward, furious now, her voice shaking. "Officer, this is absurd. Richard is the one under investigation." "Ma'am," the officer said gently, "we have to follow procedure." I knew it wasn't their fault. They were doing their jobs. But when they stepped toward me with the handcuffs, something inside me cracked open, a humiliation so deep it felt like an old wound being torn apart. "Please," I murmured without meaning to my dog. "He'll get scared." Pepper rushed forward, barking frantically, circling the officers, tail stiff and trembling. When they placed the cold metal around my wrists, Pepper howled, a sound I'd never heard from him before, raw and desperate. "Pepper!" I cried as they guided me outside. Neighbors peeked through curtains. Someone across the street stepped onto their porch. I could feel their eyes, heavy and judging. But the worst part wasn't their stares. It was Pepper trying to follow. Tugging against Dorothy's hands, his little body straining with all its strength to reach me as I was placed in the back of the police car. His cries echoed in my chest the entire ride to the station. At the precinct, they processed me with stiff efficiency. Fingerprints, photographs, a holding room with a metal bench too cold for human dignity. I sat with my hands clasped together, staring at the smudges on the floor, trying to keep my breathing even. But when the door finally opened, the last person I expected walked in. Richard's lawyer. He wore a crisp suit, in that expression a smugness that wasn't loud, but quietly satisfied, like someone who believed he had just checkmated an opponent who never saw the board. "Mrs. Patterson," he said, folding his hands on the table as if greeting a client rather than a woman he had just helped put behind bars. "If you return all marital assets, sign the divorce papers, and agree to our terms, we will drop the charges." It was the calm confidence in his voice that did it. The assumption that fear would break me, that humiliation would tame me, that I would fold like a paper doll the moment pressure was applied. But something inside me, something I didn't recognize yet, rose up like a tide. I straightened, meeting his eyes. "Tell Richard," I said, my voice so steady it surprised even me, "that I'll see him in court." His eyebrows twitched. Just a flicker, but enough to reveal that my answer wasn't the one he'd expected. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "No," I replied quietly. "Richard made this harder the moment he decided to destroy me." He stood abruptly and walked out, the door slamming behind him. 4 long hours followed. Hours where the fluorescent lights buzzed, where whispers drifted through the hall outside, where I listened to my own heartbeat, trying to outrun panic. Pepper's cries haunted me, circling my mind like ghosts. Just when I thought I couldn't hold myself upright any longer, the door opened again. This time, it was Janet. She swept into the room with a stack of documents under her arm and fire in her eyes. Dorothy was behind her, breathless, cheeks flushed, clutching Pepper's collar in one hand because, impossibly, he was with her, tail wagging the moment he saw me. "Catherine," Janet said, her voice fierce and bright, "you're getting out. Now." I blinked, disoriented. "What?" Our forensic accountant finished analyzing the bank statements, she said. Richard forged them. The withdrawals were fabricated digitally. We have proof. The officer standing behind her nodded. His tone had changed entirely. Mrs. Patterson, he said, you're free to go. We're opening an investigation into your husband's effective immediately. I felt my knees buckle. Pepper rushed forward, pawing at my legs, whining, pressing his warm body against me as if trying to hold me upright. Dorothy touched my shoulder gently. It's over, dear. This part, at least. A breath escaped me then. Not a sob, not a cry. Just a long, trembling release of something I'd been carrying far too long. The trap Richard had set had snapped shut. But not around me. Around him. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope stir in my chest. Small, fragile, but unmistakably alive. When Richard realized the countersuit was real, when he felt the walls closing in around him, he reacted exactly the way Janet predicted, with panic disguised as arrogance and desperation disguised as strategy. For a few days he scrambled in silence, calling colleagues, deleting files, moving money, pivoting from charm to intimidation to false concern, like a man flipping through every version of himself he could find, hoping one might still work. But while he tried to cover his tracks, someone else moved faster. Sarah. The same, quiet, wounded, 28-year-old woman he'd used and discarded like a prop. She stepped into the light with a courage I hadn't expected. Nor did she owe me. Maybe she didn't owe anyone. But maybe she was tired of being silent, tired of being lied to, tired of being made to feel small. She walked into the local news station, sat down with a reporter, and told the truth. All of it. She handed them the documents, the recordings, the screenshots, the financial transfers, the promises he'd made to her on late-night calls. She told them how she'd discovered she wasn't the only affair, not even close. How she'd believed she was in love with him. How it hurt to find out she was just one more woman he'd folded into his pattern. When the story aired that evening, the headline hit like a stone through glass. Real estate mogul's web of lies exposed. I watched it from Dorothy's couch, Pepper curled on my lap, his head resting on my stomach, his warm breath fogging the fabric of my sweater. Dorothy sat beside me, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her lips pressed into a hard line. Janet was standing behind us, pacing, muttering things under her breath that would have made a sailor blush. The news anchor's voice was steady, almost clinical, but every word carried a weight I could feel in the bones of my spine. Sources confirmed that Richard Patterson, co-owner of Patterson and Fields Realty, used his position and reputation to lure women into financial and emotional entanglements. Multiple victims describe a pattern of fraud, deception, and emotional manipulation. My name showed up on the screen for only a moment, primary victim Catherine Patterson, but even that was enough to make my stomach knot. The story spiraled outward like a wildfire catching dry brush. Within hours, Richard's firm issued a statement claiming concern, then surprise. Then the temporary suspension of his duties pending investigation. But everyone recognized the pattern, the public distancing, the sudden silence from colleagues who used to brag about golf trips with him. The way the company removed his photo from their website by morning. Then came the messages. 3 more women reached out. Strangers. Different ages, different cities, different lives, but their stories were eerily similar. Richard had found them during open houses, charity events, business workshops. He'd cultivated trust with smiles he'd practiced in mirrors, with compliments fine-tuned through repetition. He'd whispered promises into their lives, promises he'd never intended to keep. As each interview aired, as each woman spoke with trembling voice and eyes that looked both angry and ashamed, I felt something inside me shift, not satisfaction, not vengeance, not even vindication, just sadness. Deep, exhausted sadness. I wasn't the only one who believed him. I wasn't the only one who loved him. I wasn't the only one he broke. Pepper shifted on my lap and looked up at me with those soft, dark eyes, as if sensing something heavy settling over me. I stroked his ears, feeling the warmth of him tether me to the moment. "Don't hold your breath waiting for joy," Dorothy murmured beside me. "It won't come from this." "I know," I whispered. "That's not what I feel." "It shouldn't have happened to so many," she said, voice shaking with restrained anger. "That's what hurts the most." It was close to 9 in the evening when the pounding started on Dorothy's front door. Not a knock, a demand. "Catherine?" Richard's voice slashed through the wood. "Catherine, open the door. We need to talk." Pepper leapt off my lap, barking with frantic urgency, his nails skittering across the hardwood floor as he positioned himself between me and the door. I stood slowly, my legs trembling. Dorothy placed a hand on my arm. "Don't you dare move," she said. But I stepped toward the window instead. Something in me needed to see him, not to answer him, but to understand the truth my heart still struggled to hold. I looked through the curtains. Richard stood on the porch, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, sweat dampening the fabric around his collar. His eyes were wild, glassy, frantic, unfocused. Nothing like the composed man who had charmed entire rooms. Nothing like the husband who used to kiss my forehead in the mornings. He looked hollowed out, unraveling. "Catherine," he shouted again, slamming his fist against the doorframe. "You've ruined me. Do you understand? You've destroyed everything." His voice cracked. "We can still fix this," he begged, the desperation leaking through. "Just open the door. Please, I can explain everything. We can work this out. You just have to listen to me." I felt something inside me harden. Not cruelty, not bitterness, just clarity. The clarity of finally seeing someone without the illusions you built around them. I opened the window a few inches, enough for my voice to reach him, but not enough for him to touch the space where I stood. "You ruined yourself," I said quietly. I just stopped pretending not to see it. His face contorted, not from pain, but from the loss of control. He stepped back, looking at me like I was a stranger. And I realized in that moment, I was. I wasn't the woman who once excused his moods, softened his sharpness, or swallowed my own discomfort to keep the peace. He was yelling something as he walked away, but his words no longer mattered. Later that night, nearly midnight, a police cruiser pulled up outside. Flashing lights painted the house in pulses of red and blue. Dorothy and I stood by the window, Pepper trembling against my ankles. The officers moved quickly, professionally, without drama. Richard Patterson was arrested on charges of fraud, identity theft, embezzlement, and obstruction. His bond was set at $500,000, an amount he couldn't pay because all his accounts had been frozen earlier that afternoon. Dorothy exhaled, long and shaky. Janet nodded grimly when she heard the news. Pepper pressed his head against my leg, leaning all of his small weight into me, as if trying to anchor me in a world that suddenly felt too large and too loud. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I didn't feel triumph. I just closed my eyes and let the quiet settle around me, a quiet that for the first time in months didn't feel dangerous. Richard had fallen, but the truth was, I wasn't standing on the other side cheering. I was simply standing. And maybe after everything, that was enough. I sat in the courtroom with my hands clasped together so tightly that my knuckles had turned white, but I didn't loosen my grip. Not even when Pepper, sitting quietly in his carrier beside my feet, pressed his warm nose against my ankle as if reminding me to breathe. Janet sat on my left, her expression composed and razor-focused, while Dorothy sat on my right with a comforting hand resting lightly on my arm. I felt surrounded, but not trap-supported, something I hadn't felt in years. Richard was brought into the courtroom in a wrinkled suit I recognized but no longer associated with the man I'd married. His posture was stiff, his eyes scanning the room with the mixture of superiority and panic I'd come to recognize in the last months. The judge called the case, and his defense attorney, and overly polished man with a voice like oiled wood, immediately began trying to twist the narrative. "Your Honor," he said, "my client is a respected businessman whose wife has launched a vindictive campaign to destroy him professionally and personally." My stomach churned. I didn't say a word, but Janet leaned toward me, whispering, "Let him talk. He's about to bury himself." Richard's lawyer continued, "This is a marital dispute blown out of proportion by a bitter spouse with emotional instability." I closed my eyes, letting the words wash over me without sinking in. I knew the pattern. I had lived inside this manipulation for decades. But hearing it spoken publicly felt like watching a ghost reenact its own haunting. Then suddenly, the energy in the courtroom shifted. The prosecutor, calm, methodical, terrifying in her precisions, stood and said, "Your Honor, the state would like to submit new evidence." Richard's attorney scoffed loudly, but the prosecutor ignored him. She tapped her pen once against the table, a small sound that echoed like the start of a storm. "Mr. Patterson," she said clearly, addressing the court, "has done this before. Twice. In 2 other states, under 2 different legal names." The room inhaled collectively. My heart slammed against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy, as if the floor had tilted beneath me. I looked toward Richard. For the first time since all this began, he didn't look arrogant. He looked cornered, like a man watching the walls of a long-built lie collapse around him. "You may review the documents," the prosecutor continued, handing folders to the judge. He changed his name after each incident. Married, defrauded, emotionally manipulated, then vanished. And his previous wives were too afraid, too isolated, or too ashamed to come forward at the time. A quiet murmur rippled through the courtroom. I stared at the back of Richard's head. I felt cold and strangely hollow, like my body had stopped making new emotions because it had used them all up in the last 3 months. I had thought his betrayal was personal, unique, a strike meant only for me. But now I saw I had been one in a long line of women he'd carefully selected, like a thief choosing houses with weak locks. When the judge nodded, allowing the new evidence, 2 women rose from the gallery. I didn't know their names yet, but something inside me recognized them instantly, like bodies recovering buried memories. They were both in their 60s, like me. One held a handbag tightly against her chest. The other kept brushing at her sleeve as though trying to smooth out an anxiety she couldn't admit aloud. "Linda from Michigan," the prosecutor said softly, "and Patricia from Colorado." Linda and Patricia. My breath caught. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if grief itself had taken physical form between us. We looked at each other across the room. In each of their eyes I saw my own reflection: hurt, humiliation, bewilderment, a longing to understand why someone who claimed to love us had instead carved so deeply into the most tender parts of our lives. Shared trauma has a way of closing distances no bridge could span. After the hearing, which ended with Richard's bail upheld and the judge openly criticizing his past behavior, I walked out of the courthouse on legs that trembled slightly. Pepper trotted beside me, his fluffy ears bouncing with every determined step. The crisp Oregon air felt strange in my lungs, too clean after everything I had just learned. Outside, Linda and Patricia waited uncertainly, like women standing at the edge of a truth they'd never planned to revisit. I approached them slowly, Pepper sniffing curiously at their shoes before deciding they were safe. He wagged his tail gently, then sat between us as though inviting the conversation. Linda spoke first. Her voice was soft, frayed. "I lost my family home," she said. "He took out loans in my name. By the time I realized what he was doing, it was gone. 25 years of my life, and I never recovered financially." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a quiet, exhausted sadness that made my chest tighten. Patricia wiped the corner of her eye discreetly. "I blamed myself," she admitted, "for 20 years. I thought I'd been stupid, weak, gullible. She swallowed hard. He stole more than money. He stole the version of myself I used to trust. I slowly sat down beside them on a low ledge outside the courthouse. Pepper hopped into my lap without asking permission, his warm little body anchoring me. I stroked his fur, grounding myself in the simple reality of his presence. I thought I'd been the only one, I whispered. I thought I was losing my mind. Linda nodded with a grim, knowing sigh. He makes you feel that way. He studies you. He learns what you ache for and what you fear, and he isolates you, Patricia added. He makes sure you can't reach for help because he's already cut off the places where help could come from. I exhaled shakily. It felt like a door inside me, one I'd kept bolted shut, had cracked open. Sitting there, the three of us realized something that should have been obvious, but had been obscured by guilt, manipulation, and long-cultivated shame. We weren't stupid. We weren't weak. We weren't naive women who let our guard down. We had been deliberately chosen by a predator who sought out lonely, kind-hearted women with assets. Women who still believed in softness, in loyalty, in second chances. Women who carried love like an offering, unaware that he saw it as a resource to mine rather than a gift to cherish. I felt something shift inside me, something quiet but fierce. It wasn't anger, though anger simmered beneath my ribs like a slow burn. It wasn't victory, because there was nothing victorious about surviving a man like Richard. It was recognition. Recognition that I wasn't alone. Recognition that what happened to me had happened to others. And not because of any flaw in us, but because of something broken and malignant inside him. Recognition that healing, for the first time, felt possible. As Pepper curled against my chest, trembling slightly as though absorbing the emotional weight in the air, I whispered into the soft fur between his ears, "We're going to be okay. All of us." And for the first time since my marriage shattered, I believed it. The weeks after the bail hearing unfolded slowly, like a long exhale after years of holding my breath. Each morning, I woke up in Dorothy's guest room with Pepper curled against the back of my legs, warm and steady, the soft rhythm of his breathing reassuring me that I was not alone in any of this. I had spent decades believing strength meant endurance, silence, patience. Now I was learning strength could also mean gathering with others, sharing the truth out loud, refusing to shrink into shame. It began with the four of us, me, Sarah, Linda, and Patricia, sitting around Dorothy's large wooden dining table one rainy Oregon evening. The storm outside rattled the windows, but the room itself felt like a cocoon, full of soft lamplight and the quiet resolve of women who had finally found one another. Sarah spread out manila folders, digital drives, printed screenshots, and old documents like pieces of a puzzle we were determined to complete. "We're going to build an ironclad case," she said, her voice steady, though her eyes revealed the exhaustion of someone who'd been carrying this secret far too long. Linda nodded, pushing her glasses up the bridge of her nose. "This time, he won't slip through the cracks." Patricia exhaled shakily. He always counted on us being alone, scattered, embarrassed, too hurt to look outward. I looked around the table at their faces, faces marked by different histories but the same wound, and felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time, belonging. We weren't just witnesses. We weren't just victims. We were allies. Soon, the circle widened. Ashley came first, younger than us, only 35, with eyes still swollen from betrayal but carrying a fierce determination. She joined one evening with trembling hands, holding a folder filled with text messages, photos, payments, and emails. "I don't know what I'm doing," she confessed, wiping her eyes. "But I want to help." I reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "You're already helping." Then came the two other girlfriends who'd contacted Sarah after the news broke. They arrived cautiously, one still shaking from nerves, the other quiet and withdrawn. Yet as they sat with us, shoulders gradually unclenching, something softened in the room. By the end of the week, we had become a network of 7 women who had all been manipulated, lied to, financially exploited, or emotionally damaged by Richard. 7 different stories, all threaded together by the same man and the same patterns. We learned everything. We learned he had chosen women with surgical accuracy, grief counseling groups where people were raw, grieving spouses or parents longing for connection, charity events where kindness and generosity were common traits, conferences for community service, volunteer workshops, yoga studios with widows' gatherings, farmers markets early on Sunday mornings, where people in emotional transition often wandered with soft, lonely eyes. He had called them chance meetings, but they hadn't been chance at all. He had searched for women carrying invisible wounds, the kind that made them temporarily blind to red flags. He had mined empathy like a resource, and he had groomed trust like an asset. As we pieced together his methods, something inside me slowly straightened, a spine I didn't know I still had. Dorothy, always the organizer, always the one thinking 3 steps ahead, suggested we do more than gather evidence. We should help others recognize the signs, she said. If he could do this to so many women here, imagine how many others are facing someone like him right now. Her words lit a spark that quickly grew into purpose. Within days, the living room transformed into a miniature office. My laptop, Sarah's tablets, Linda's notes, Patricia's meticulous lists, Ashley's draft designs, all spread out like puzzle pieces again. Pepper wandered between our legs, occasionally resting his chin on a knee as if offering emotional support to whoever needed it most in that moment. Dorothy handled the technical side. She created a website where we documented patterns of romance fraud, red flags, and personal stories anonymized for safety. We created a list of warning signs: sudden flattery, pressure to isolate, inconsistent financial stories. Secretive habits, strategic vulnerability used to manipulate empathy. The list grew longer than any of us expected. The website launched quietly, but it didn't stay quiet for long. A local journalist shared it. Then a regional victims advocacy group. Then a national news outlet included it in a feature on financial abuse and romance scams. Within weeks, the story had gained national attention, not because of Richard alone, but because of the movement we'd inadvertently created. And then came the email. It was from the director of a victims advocacy conference in Seattle. We would be honored if you would speak about your experience and the community response you've helped create. Women across the country need to hear this. When I first read it, my hands went cold. Me? Speak? Alone? In public? I can't, I whispered. Dorothy looked at me over her glasses. Yes, you can. Sarah squeezed my shoulder. You've already been speaking, Catherine. This is just a bigger room. Linda and Patricia nodded, and Ashley added softly, Tell them what he did. Tell them what we're doing now. Pepper barked once, wagging his tail, as if voting with them, so I agreed. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing backstage in a Seattle hotel ballroom, clutching a microphone and breathing through the nervous tightness in my chest. Pepper stood beside me, now officially registered as an emotional support animal. He wore a tiny blue harness with a patch that read, Here to Help. When my name was called, the applause startled me. But walking onto that stage with Pepper trotting faithfully at my side, I felt a steadiness rise within me. 200 people sat before me. Advocates, survivors, counselors, social workers. Faces full of expectation, empathy, and quiet strength. I took a breath. My name is Catherine, I began, my voice trembling at first. And for 32 years, I believed that kindness was my weakness. Pepper nudged my leg gently, grounding me. But now I know it's my greatest strength. Richard's greatest mistake. I paused, feeling emotion tighten my throat, was believing that kindness meant I would never fight back. A murmur rippled through the audience. I told the truth. All of it. The manipulation, the lies, the financial fraud, the identity theft. I told them about the nights I cried alone in a marriage I thought I understood, about the humiliation of being handcuffed for a crime I didn't commit, about finding the other women, the shock, the grief, the shared pain that somehow made us stronger. I told them about Pepper, how his small body had been the one constant source of love when everything else crumbled. And I told them about the sisterhood that had formed, not out of vengeance, but survival. When I finished, the applause rose slowly at first, then built into something deep, warm, humbling. Pepper barked once, as though accepting the praise. Afterward, dozens of women approached me, each with their own stories, some about husbands, some about boyfriends, some about siblings, caretakers, even financial advisors. So many stories, so much hidden pain. And I realized then, painfully, beautifully, that what we were doing was bigger than my personal justice, bigger than Richard, bigger than all of us. We were changing something. We were illuminating a system that had let predators hide for too long. We were giving shame a name and then taking it apart. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the future not just approaching, but opening, wide enough to walk into without fear. The courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, the kind of scent that lingers in places where too many secrets have been spoken and too many truths dragged trembling into the light. Every morning for 3 weeks, I walked through those heavy double doors with Pepper trotting faithfully at my side. His little harness clicked softly with each step, a sound that became my metronome of courage. I never imagined I would spend my retirement sitting on a courtroom bench, watching the man I once promised to love stand trial for crimes so elaborate and cruel they barely felt real when spoken aloud. Yet there I was, day after day, clutching Pepper's warm body against my chest during breaks, telling myself I could endure just a little more. Just one more witness, one more piece of evidence, one more lie dismantled. The first day, Richard refused to look at me. He sat with his shoulders high, jaw clenched, lips pressed into a thin, bitter line. His expensive suit looked ill-fitting now, like it belonged to a person who no longer existed. I watched his hands tremble slightly on the defense table, not from remorse, but from a pride so fractured it could barely hold itself together. His lawyers wasted no time painting him as a respectable businessman who had been dragged into a campaign of revenge led by bitter, aging women. I felt those words like a physical blow, though part of me had expected it. They spoke with smooth voices, practiced indignation, and carefully rehearsed pity for their client. But every time the defense tried to twist the narrative, the prosecution laid down facts like bricks, heavy, undeniable, unmovable. Bank statements, forged signatures, false identities, emails where Richard pretended to be grieving, needy, adoring, depending on what each woman was most vulnerable to, screenshots, testimonies, digital trails he thought he had erased but hadn't. A web so intricately spun that the judge himself, a stern man with half-moon glasses, occasionally shook his head in disbelief. Pepper would shift in my lap whenever the tension in the room surged. Sometimes I'd feel his heartbeat against my wrist, steady, grounding, a reminder that I still belonged to a life beyond Richard's reach. But nothing prepared me for the moment the prosecutor unveiled the notebook. It looked ordinary at first glance, a black leather cover, worn edges, the kind of notebook a person might use for grocery lists or private reflections. But as the prosecutor slid it into evidence, the room stilled. "This," he said quietly, "is the defendant's handwritten playbook." Richard's head snapped toward the exhibit, his eyes widening. That was the first moment in the entire trial he looked genuinely afraid. The prosecutor opened it with the care of someone handling a bomb. "Page 12, he said. The screen behind him flickered to life with the scanned page. My breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakably Richard's bold, confident cursive I had seen on birthday cards. documents, mortgage papers, shopping lists, love notes he'd written early in our marriage. Except this writing was different. Colder, clinical, predatory. The words were stark, damning. Target women 55 to 70, widowed or divorced, with property or retirement accounts. Preferably isolated from family or in emotional transition. Build trust through sympathy and shared pain. Establish financial dependency. Extract resources before disengagement. My stomach lurched. The room murmured. Someone behind me gasped loudly. Pepper whimpered, sensing the sudden shift in me. I leaned forward, gripping the pew so tightly my knuckles turned white. The prosecutor's voice softened. These are the defendant's own words. His strategy. His plan. Richard's lawyer objected in a frantic burst of legal jargon, but the judge overruled him without hesitation. For 32 years, I had built a life beside that handwriting. I had trusted it. I had made grocery lists while he scribbled in notebooks like this one. I had gone to bed while he sat in his office, writing, thinking, planning. For years I believed he was working to build a future with me. But he had been mapping out the destruction of women just like me. Watching his playbook displayed for the court, I felt the last surviving piece of the woman who loved him splinter and dissolve. There was no grief left, no anger, just a dense, quiet certainty that I had loved someone who had never existed. Richard looked at me, then, finally, fully. His eyes were wild, pleading, furious, desperate for me to believe some story, any story that could excuse this. But all I felt was a stillness so complete, it almost frightened me. The trial continued, but the momentum had shifted irreversibly. Every lie Richard's attorneys tried to spin now sounded hollow. Every witness they called crumbled under cross-examination. Every accusation they hurled at us, the women he had targeted, dissolved in the face of cold evidence. By the time closing arguments finished, the outcome seemed inevitable. Still, as the jury filed out to deliberate, I felt a tremor of fear beneath my ribs. What if reason failed? What if some tiny crack in the system let him slip through again the way he had in other states, hurting other women whose names we might never know? I held Pepper against my chest, whispering into his soft fur, "Whatever happens, we told the truth. We showed them everything." 4 hours later, barely enough time for the sun outside to shift positions, the jury returned. The courtroom filled with a tension so heavy, it felt like the air itself had thickened. I could hear my pulse in my ears. I could feel Pepper's small chest rising and falling under my palm. The forewoman stood, her voice clear. Guilty on all counts. Fraud, identity theft, elder abuse, conspiracy. Each word was a stone dropping into a lake, sending ripples that seemed to reach into every corner of my life. When she finished, a hush fell. Not silence, but the collective breath of a room realizing justice had finally spoken. Richard turned to me then. His eyes were hollow, shocked, betrayed, as though I had done something to him. As though exposing the truth was somehow worse than the truth itself. For a brief second, I saw the man I once loved flicker behind his expression, like a shadow passing over a window. But then, the moment vanished. I met his gaze with a calm that felt earned, chiseled, forged through every humiliation and heartbreak he had inflicted. There were no tears, no triumph, only certainty. It was over. The judge announced that sentencing would be scheduled 3 weeks later. The prosecution was recommending 15 to 20 years. Enough time, they said, to ensure he couldn't manipulate another soul. When court adjourned, I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. Pepper barked once, then pressed his head into my leg as if sensing that something immense had ended, and something new, fragile, unsteady, but undeniably real, had just begun. Justice had been served. But healing was only beginning. Richard received 18 years in prison, and when the judge read the sentence, There was a hush in the courtroom so complete it felt sacred. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just still. A kind of stillness that comes after a storm finally exhausts itself. The restitution order followed, a lengthy list of damages and repayments that couldn't truly return the years he'd taken from us. But it was a start, a formal acknowledgement from the world that what happened mattered, that we mattered. A week later, I stood on the porch of my parents' house, the house that had been stolen from me by forged signatures and sleight-of-hand manipulation, and I rested my palm on the wooden frame beside the door. The paint was chipped in the same places it had been 30 years ago. The wind still carried the faint scent of cedar from the backyard. And as I stepped inside, Pepper trotted beside me, tail lifting in curious little arcs, as if he, too, could sense something had shifted. Something once broken was being returned to its rightful owner. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. Instead, I exhaled slow and deep, feeling my breath reach corners of myself I had forgotten existed. The house wasn't just an inheritance, it was a symbol of the voice I'd finally reclaimed. The girl who had grown up here had trusted too icily. The woman who walked back in now had learned how to trust herself. I didn't waste time. Within 3 months, the place was transformed, not polished or glamorous, just warm, safe, and full of quiet corners where a woman could sit and remember she wasn't alone. Dorothy stood with me on the first official day we opened the doors, her hand wrapped gently around mine. "Can you believe we're doing this?" she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to betray how much it meant to her. "I can," I said, "because we needed this long before we even knew it existed." Women came in slowly at first, one with a trembling voice who kept apologizing for taking space, another who flinched whenever someone spoke too quickly, another who had forgotten how to sleep without leaving a light on. Pepper, sweet, gentle soul that he is, would curl beside them, resting his head on their knee as if reminding them they were safe now. He'd taken the training well, officially certified as a therapy dog, but truthfully, he'd been one all along. Linda and Patricia helped from a distance at first, still rebuilding their own lives. But eventually, they moved to Portland, close enough to work with us regularly. The 3 of us created workshops in a bright room overlooking the garden. We filled it with folding chairs, handwritten pamphlets, and an old whiteboard salvaged from a thrift shop. Women came to learn, but they also came to reclaim something of themselves, the part that had been called naive, dramatic, too trusting, too forgiving, too hopeful. We told them hope wasn't the problem, manipulation was. One woman cried after a session and said, "I thought I was stupid." "No," I told her softly. "You were kind." "And someone mistook that for permission to break you." Her shoulders shook as she leaned into us, and for a moment, I saw my old self reflected in her eyes, the version of me who had once apologized for bleeding after being cut. Sarah's transformation was quieter, but no less beautiful. She returned to school for social work, her determination burning steadier than ever. Spiritually, in the places the law doesn't reach. I remember smiling at the way her voice steadied itself with that intention. Betrayal had shaken her, but it hadn't taken her purpose. Life grew softer with time. On warm afternoons, I'd walk through the revived garden behind my parents' house, my house now, with Pepper bounding ahead, nose buried in blooms, tail wagging with unfiltered joy. Sometimes he'd pause and look back at me as if checking I was truly there, truly safe, truly free. I'd kneel beside him, running my fingers through his curls as sunlight spilled across the grass. Survivors would sit on the back steps with cups of tea, letting their shoulders fall as they watched us. "Is he always this sweet?" one asked once. "Always," I said. "He's been with me through everything." And Pepper pressed closer, as if he understood. My brother Tom began visiting once a month, no longer distant or strained. He'd fix loose fence boards, help install new shelves, sit with me on the porch in the evenings. Sometimes we didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Some bonds don't break, they simply wait. One evening he asked cautiously, "Do you ever feel angry that you lost so many years?" I thought about it. I looked at the house glowing softly in the dusk, at Pepper asleep beside my feet, at the laughter of women drifting from inside. "No," I finally said. "I feel grateful I've found the strength to stop losing any more." People sometimes ask if I'm bitter, if my faith in love has dissolved into something cynical. They expect hardness, maybe even vengeance. But the truth is gentler, more complicated. Love didn't fail me. Love simply asked me to evolve, to stop confusing loyalty with self-abandonment, to recognize that real affection isn't earned by shrinking. I tell them the strongest love isn't blind. It sees clearly. It demands honesty and respect and accountability. And when those things are missing, the most loving act is often the hardest one. Walking away into the night with only your dog and your dignity. Trusting that's enough to rebuild a whole new life from the ashes. And in my case, it was. If you connected with this journey of justice, healing, and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life.